The millionaire's son never smiled, until one day the father enters the house and sees his simple nanny dancing with the autistic boy, in a moment so pure that time seems to stop. But what he does next, between anger, guilt, and something he had never felt before, changes everything. The sound of waves crashing against the immense floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse was the only soundtrack in Richard's life. To the world outside, he was the picture of success, a young, elegant man who had turned a small tech startup into an empire. His fortune, built on bold investments in stocks and cryptocurrency, was a constant topic in the society columns, and his net worth grew with every new deal he closed. Yet, inside that minimalist apartment, with its white walls and designer furniture that looked more like sculptures, a profound silence reigned, vaster and more oppressive than the ocean itself. Ever since his wife had passed 2 years ago, Richard had grown accustomed to living in a muted grief, but his greatest pain came not from her absence, but from the presence of his son, Leo. The 5-year-old boy, with his large, distant eyes, lived in a private universe. Shielded from the world by a pair of colorful headphones he rarely took off. Leo's autism was a barrier that all of Richard's money couldn't breach. He could buy anything, from private islands to rare works of art, but he didn't know how to buy a smile from his own son. That morning, the silence was broken by the doorbell. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper who managed the home with a chilly efficiency, answered the door and wrinkled her nose discreetly. The woman standing in the hallway looked nothing like the previous candidates. She wore a simple cotton dress, worn-out flats, and carried a patched-up tote bag. Her name was Sophia. Her eyes, however, held a serene sparkle, and a shy but genuine smile bloomed on her lips when she saw Richard approach. He analyzed her with the same suspicion he would a new high-risk investment. He needed help, but his instincts made him recoil. All the previous nannies, with their impeccable resumes and advanced pedagogical methods, had failed. What could this simple woman from a working-class neighborhood possibly offer? Still, something compelled him to give her a chance. He led her into the living room, where Leo was sitting on the floor, engrossed, rocking a small wooden block back and forth, a rhythmic, repetitive motion that soothed him. Sophia said nothing. She didn't try to get closer, didn't force an introduction. She just watched. Richard explained the routine, the difficulties, the meltdowns. He spoke of the boy's sensitivity to loud noises, his aversion to touch, his selective eating habits. With every word, he felt the weight of his own failure. Sophia listened intently, her gaze fixed on the boy. When Richard finished, an awkward silence hung in the air. He expected questions, suggestions, perhaps a demonstration of technical knowledge, but she just nodded slowly. Then, she did something that surprised him. With a delicacy that seemed rehearsed, she sat on the floor at a respectful distance from Leo and opened her patched-up bag. From it, she didn't pull out an educational toy or a tablet. She took out a small seashell, polished and bright. Without looking at the boy, she brought the shell to her own ear, closed her eyes, and smiled, as if she were listening to the most wonderful secret in the world. Leo's rocking slowed. He stopped moving the wooden block. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he turned his head, his gaze, once lost in the void, focused for the first time on the woman sitting on the floor. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, but his eyes fixed on the shell were a silent question. Across the room, watching the scene, Richard held his breath. It was just a look, a fleeting instant. But in that apartment where nothing ever happened, that look was an earthquake. That look from Leo was the only authorization Richard needed. He hired Sophia on the spot, ignoring the disapproving glance from Mrs. Gable, who seemed to view the new nanny as a flaw in the impeccable system she ran. In the days that followed, Sophia's presence in the penthouse was like a gentle breeze, almost imperceptible. but one that slowly began to change the stagnant air. She didn't try to fill the silence with forced conversations or loud activities. Instead, she introduced sounds, small sounds. The tinkling of a wind chime she discreetly hung on the balcony, the murmur of a lullaby she hummed quietly while tidying Leo's toys, the sound of water being poured slowly from one glass to another. She seemed to understand that Leo's world wasn't devoid of sound, but rather overwhelmed by it. Her job was to filter the noise, leaving only the melody. Richard watched from afar, from the doorway of his home office. Feeling like an intruder in his own house, he saw his son, who once only found calm in the isolation of his headphones, now following Sophia through the rooms, drawn by the gentle rhythm she created. The real transformation, however, happened on a Thursday afternoon. The Miami sun was gilding the ocean outside, but inside the apartment, the light seemed cold. Sophia was sitting on the plush living room rug, with Leo beside her. From her patched-up bag, she took out a small Bluetooth speaker, no bigger than the palm of her hand. With a touch, a light piano melody began to float through the air. It was a simple piece, with clear, spaced-out notes without any sudden shifts. Leo, who had been concentrating on stacking his blocks, stopped. He looked up, his head tilting slightly, like a bird hearing an unfamiliar sound. Sophia just smiled and began to nod her head to the rhythm of the music. Leo mimicked her, a subtle movement. Then his body began to sway back and forth, no longer out of anxiety, but in sync with the melody. Sophia stood up, her bare feet gliding on the rug, and began to dance around him, a playful, gentle movement. And that's when it happened. A sound Richard hadn't heard in years echoed through the room, Leo's laugh. A genuine, open laugh that rose from the depths of his chest and filled the apartment with life. At that exact moment, Richard entered the room. He was coming from a stressful conference call about the fluctuation of his stocks, his head full of numbers, profits, and dividends. The scene paralyzed him. The sight of his son laughing, in that free and pure way, was a punch to the gut. A wave of emotion washed over him, so strong it made him dizzy. It was gratitude, it was relief, but underneath it all, a sting of something bitter, jealousy. Someone else, a stranger, had achieved what he, with all his wealth and power, never could. Pride, the armor he had worn for so long, won. He straightened his posture, his expression hardening. "I didn't hire you to play," he said, his voice firm, cutting through the music and laughter like a blade of ice. The melody stopped. Sophia looked down, her face flushing with shame. "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered. But before she could move away, Leo, his eyes filled with an unprecedented urgency, reached out his small hand, grabbed the hem of her dress, and pointed to his headphones on the floor, as if to say, with all the clarity his silence allowed, "Stay, the music stays." Leo's gesture was a verdict. Richard, the man whose words moved markets and closed multi-million-dollar deals, was left speechless. He looked at his son's small hand, clutching Sophia's dress, and felt the structure of his controlled world tremble. He took a step back, a lump forming in his throat. He couldn't apologize. Pride was a gag, but he couldn't repeat the order either. He just gave a rigid, almost imperceptible nod and retreated to his office, closing the door behind him. The sound of the piano resumed, softer this time, but to Richard, it sounded like the announcement of his own defeat. He sat in his Italian leather chair, staring at the investment charts blinking on his computer screen, but he didn't see the numbers. He only saw the scene in the living room, a simple woman and his son, laughing, connected by something his vast capital couldn't buy. That unsettling feeling, jealousy, returned with greater force, mixed with a gratitude he refused to admit. It was humiliating to realize that while he spent his days growing his net worth, someone else was actually enriching his son's life. With that silent permission, the apartment's routine was transformed. Sophia began to weave a tapestry of soft sounds throughout the day. In the morning, the rhythm was marked by spoons tapping lightly against ceramic mugs. In the afternoon, by the sound of rice grains shaking inside a plastic bottle, creating a makeshift maraca. Leo, once a reclusive statue in his own world, began to participate. His little fingers, which before only moved in repetitive patterns, now explored the sonic textures of pots and lids, discovering music in the most mundane objects. Mrs. Gable observed it all with veiled contempt. To her, this wasn't therapy. It was a mess. It was a breach of the order and sophistication she worked so hard to maintain, an affront to the memory of the former lady of the house, who would have never allowed such disarray. "This girl is turning the penthouse into a community center playroom," she grumbled once to Richard as he was getting coffee. "Mrs. Brooke, from the floor above, has already asked about the noise." Richard just ignored her, but the seed of concern about others' judgment was planted. One evening, he was returning from a late meeting. The day had been exhausting, a high-stakes negotiation involving a European investment fund. He entered the apartment expecting the usual silence, but found Sophia in the living room, sitting on the floor with only a single lamp on. Leo was sleeping peacefully on the sofa, his head on a cushion, without his headphones. She was sewing one of the patches on her tote bag. Seeing him, she startled and began to get up. "No, stay," he said, his voice softer than he intended. He walked closer, the exhaustion weighing on his shoulders. "Thank you," he said. Finally, the word came out with difficulty. "For what you did today, for him." Sophia just looked at him, her large, expressive eyes reflecting the soft light. Time seemed to stand still for a moment. In that gaze, there was no employee and boss. There were just a man and a woman, sharing a moment of silent vulnerability. The attraction was sudden, unexpected, an electric current that caught him off guard. He felt an impulse to move closer, to touch her face, but was interrupted by a shrill voice from the doorway. "Ricky, darling, you left the door unlocked. How dangerous." Brooke, the neighbor from upstairs, a divorced socialite with a predatory gaze, entered without ceremony. Her eyes swept over the scene, Richard near Sophia, the intimate atmosphere in the air. A sly smile formed on her lips. "Am I interrupting something between you two lovebirds?" Brooke's question hung in the air, laced with venom and malice. Richard felt his blood run cold. The moment of vulnerability with Sophia shattered, replaced by a cold urgency for control. He straightened up, the armor of the billionaire businessman reassembling itself instantly. "Brooke, don't be ridiculous," he said, his voice sharp. "Sophia was just updating me on Leo's day. She was already leaving." The tone was dismissive, calculated to relegate Sophia to a mere employee and nullify any suspicion. Sophia felt the impact of the words like a slap. She shrank back, her face burning with humiliation, and murmured an almost inaudible, "Excuse me," gathering her bag and practically fleeing the room. Brooke watched her leave with a victorious smirk, then turned to Richard, fanning herself with her hand. "Oh, darling, no need to be so defensive. I was just teasing. But you do have to be careful. With your fortune, it's only natural that people will approach you with ulterior motives. A nanny so simple, you know how it is." She gestured around the apartment, as if the luxury of Richard's possessions were a magnet for opportunists. He didn't answer, just walked her to the door, his jaw tight with anger. Anger at Brooke, but mostly at himself for allowing her to corner him like that. The seed of gossip, once planted, germinated quickly in the fertile soil of that building. The next day, the atmosphere in the house had changed. Mrs. Gable, who had likely either overheard the conversation or been informed by her network of contacts in the building, treated Sophia with open hostility. Her glances were little daggers, and her instructions, given in an icy tone, made it clear that the nanny was a piece out of place. Sophia felt the weight of judgment in every corner of the apartment. The space that had started to feel welcoming had now become enemy territory. She tried to focus on Leo, on their music and his small progress, but the joy of her work was tainted by a persistent sadness. That look from Richard, the look that for a brief moment had seen her as a woman and not an employee, had been erased. In its place was now a professional distance, an invisible but insurmountable wall. He barely looked her in the eyes, and their interactions were limited to formal questions about his son's well-being. Richard, for his part, was drowning in his own conflict. Guilt gnawed at him. He knew he had been cruel to Sophia, that he had used her to protect his image. But the fear of scandal was greater. He was a public figure. His name wasn't just tied to an impressive net worth, but to a brand of success and stability. Any rumor, no matter how small, could affect his investors' confidence, the value of his stock, the stability of his businesses. He remembered how his father had taught him to protect the family's capital, to never mix emotions and finances. And what was Sophia but a dangerous emotion, an uncalculated risk? He tried to convince himself that his coldness was a necessary protective measure, not just for him, but for Leo and for the memory of his wife. But late at night, when silence reigned once more, he remembered Sophia's hurt expression, and the justification felt empty and cowardly. The truth was, he was scared, not of what others would think, but of what he himself was beginning to feel. And that was a type of liability he didn't know how to manage. Tormented, he made a decision. He had to nip it in the bud, establish clear rules. In the late afternoon, as Sophia prepared to leave, he called her into his office. His tone was serious, the setting formal. She entered, her heart tight with apprehension, and stood before his imposing desk. He faced her, his face an impenetrable mask. "Sophia," he began, his voice devoid of any warmth, "we need to talk about the boundaries of your work here." Sophia felt the floor disappear from under her feet. The word boundaries sounded like a sentence, echoing the coldness with which he had treated her the night before. She clutched the strap of her tote bag, her knuckles turning white, and braced herself for the worst. Richard, avoiding her gaze, focused on a random spot on the wall behind her, as if addressing a board of directors. "Given the circumstances," he began, his voice formal and distant, "I think it's prudent we establish some rules to avoid misunderstandings. Your job here is to care for Leo. That's it. I ask that you maintain a strictly professional distance. Our conversations should be limited to matters concerning him. Outside of your work hours, any social interaction is out of the question." Each word was a precise, calculated blow. He was putting her back in her place, demarcating the social chasm that separated them. That brief moment of connection, of shared vulnerability, had been nothing but an illusion. To him, she was just another asset to be managed, a risk to be contained within his portfolio of human investments. The worst part for Sophia wasn't the humiliation, but the pain of a hope she hadn't even known she was nurturing being crushed. She didn't cry, she didn't plead, she just nodded, her chin held high in a fragile attempt to preserve what was left of her dignity. "I understand, Mr. Richard," she said, her voice low but steady. "It won't happen again." She turned and left the office, leaving him alone with the weight of his own words. He wanted to believe he had done the right thing, that he was protecting his family and his assets, but the image of her face, pale and wounded, refused to fade. He sank into his chair, feeling like a coward. Outside, life in the apartment changed drastically. The music didn't stop all at once, but it lost its volume, its joy. Sophia continued to care for Leo, but now with a mechanical efficiency, devoid of the spontaneity and affection that had once defined her. Her smiles were restrained, her gestures calculated. She moved through the penthouse like a ghost, avoiding crossing paths with Richard, timing her trips to the kitchen so as not to run into him. The apartment, which for a brief period had been filled with melody and laughter, plunged back into the oppressive silence from before. Leo was the first to feel the change. Children, especially those who live on his spectrum of sensitivity, are seismographs of the human soul. He didn't understand the words spoken in the office, but he felt the dissonance in the air, the tension that now vibrated between his father and Sophia. The music she played no longer had the same magic. It was just sound, not feeling, and he reacted in the only way he knew how, by shutting down. The colorful headphones once again became his protective shell, the rhythmic rocking returned, and his eyes were lost again on that private horizon where no one could reach him. He stopped looking for Sophia, stopped following her footsteps through the house. He retreated, and with him, the small flame of joy that had illuminated that place. Richard watched his son's regression with growing desperation. The peace he had bought at the cost of Sophia's dignity had turned out to be a bad investment. The interest was his son's sadness. Guilt haunted him, becoming an emotional liability that devalued all his other riches. He had tried to protect his world, but in doing so, he had rebuilt the walls exactly where they had begun to crumble. The silence he so dreaded was back, louder and more accusatory than ever, a constant reminder of his failure not as a businessman, but as a father and as a man. And at the center of this silence was the absence of his son's laughter, a sound whose value he only understood once he had lost it. The days that followed were a dissonant symphony, a melody of silence and regret. Richard tried to fill the void with what he did best, managing. He created a new routine for Leo, with rigid schedules for sensory activities and therapies he had exhaustively researched online, investing in expensive equipment that promised miracles. He bought the best toys, the most recommended books, turning his son's room into a showcase of pedagogical resources. But Leo remained unreachable, a little ghost inside his own home. He rejected the new toys, pushed his father's hand away when he tried to guide him in an activity. Richard's wealth, which could move mountains in the business world, was useless here. Money bought the tools, but not the connection. Every failed attempt to connect with his son was a reminder that the only person who had found the key to that private universe had been summarily stripped of her humanity. He felt like a man who owned a treasure map, but had driven away the only guide who knew how to read it. Sophia, for her part, fulfilled her role with painful precision. She arrived on time, performed her duties with quiet efficiency, and left without saying a word more than was necessary. The patched-up tote bag, which once seemed like an endless source of little magic, now remained closed, a symbol of the creativity that had been stifled. She no longer brought seashells, or wind chimes, or sang impromptu melodies. She just followed the new routine imposed by Richard, a routine that was technically perfect but emotionally sterile. Sometimes their eyes would meet for an instant in the hallway, and in those brief moments, Richard saw an ocean of pain and disappointment in her eyes, a reflection of his own failure. He wanted to say something, to apologize, but the words died in his throat, suffocated by pride and shame. The order he had imposed was a prison for all of them. Mrs. Gable seemed to be the only one satisfied. "Now the house is in order, as it should be," she commented once, and the remark, which should have sounded like a compliment, only deepened the wound in Richard's chest. One night, the loneliness became unbearable. Leo was already asleep, and Sophia had left hours ago. Richard entered his son's room, the silence buzzing in his ears. He sat on the edge of the bed, watching the boy's peaceful breathing. He felt like a complete failure. He began to tidy the toys scattered on the floor, a mechanical gesture to appease his anxiety. As he put a book back on the small shelf, his fingers brushed against something different, a small cardboard card tucked between the pages. He pulled it out. It was a simple musical card with a drawing of a dancing note on the cover. Probably an old gift, he thought. But when he turned it over, he recognized Sophia's delicate handwriting on a small label stuck to the back. For Leo. Richard's heart pounded. He didn't know when she had given it to the boy. Maybe in the first few days, before he had built his walls. His hands trembled slightly as he held the small object. There, in that dark and silent room, the little card seemed to contain all the sound and all the joy that had been banished from that house. He hesitated for a long moment, his finger hovering over the small button with the play symbol. The fear of what he might hear fought against a desperate need to hear it. Finally, taking a breath, he pressed it, and in the absolute silence, Sophia's soft voice filled the room. Not singing, but speaking, like a whispered secret. When the world is too loud, close your eyes and dance slowly. Sophia's voice, emerging from that small piece of cardboard, was the shockwave that brought down Richard's final wall. Dance slowly. The phrase, so simple and so profound, echoed in the silence of the room and demolished the fortress he had built around himself. He didn't cry, but something inside him broke irrevocably. His entire life had been a frantic dance, the race to grow his capital, the obsession with profits and dividends, the constant watch over the stock market, the relentless pace of business. He had never danced slowly. He didn't even know how. In that instant, he understood the extent of his poverty. What good was a fortune in dollars? A net worth that placed him among the country's wealthiest men, if he was incapable of understanding the rhythm of his own heart. Sophia's message wasn't advice, it was a revelation. She wasn't just talking to Leo, she was talking to him. And he, with all his genius for investments and returns, only now understood. That night, Richard didn't sleep. He sat on the balcony, the cool ocean wind whipping his face, and for the first time, he listened. He listened to the sound of the sea, not as a background noise to his loneliness, but as an ancient, constant breath. He listened to the distant hum of the city, the pulse of millions of lives he had always viewed from above, like a map of opportunities, but never as a song. Sophia's phrase had completely disarmed him. He realized his rigidity didn't protect him from anything. It only isolated him from everything that still connected him to life, from everything that truly mattered. He had treated Sophia as a risk, a liability on his emotional balance sheet, when in fact she was the most valuable asset that had ever entered his home, a treasure he had, in his arrogance, almost thrown away. The dawn found him a different man. He got up and, instead of turning on the financial news channel, went to the kitchen and brewed a coffee, paying attention to the sound of the hot water dripping over the grounds, to the aroma that filled the air. They were small sounds, textures of life he had always ignored, too busy building his empire. The silent transformation that began that night blossomed into an unshakable decision by morning. He was in the middle of a video conference with investors from Zurich, discussing a crypto fund, when he looked through the glass wall of his office and saw Leo sitting on the floor, motionless, headphones on, the portrait of the loneliness he himself had imposed. Something snapped inside him. He stood up abruptly. "Gentlemen, my apologies. Something unavoidable has come up. We'll continue this later." He ended the call, ignoring the confused voices on the other end. He walked with firm steps to the cabinet where Mrs. Gable kept the employee files. He opened the drawer marked S and pulled out Sophia's folder. There it was, in simple handwriting, her full name, her phone number, and an address in a working-class neighborhood he only knew from the traffic map. At that moment, Mrs. Gable entered the office. "Sir, is something wrong with your business? You never interrupt a meeting." Her eyes fell on the folder he was holding. Richard didn't answer. He just folded the paper with the address and put it in his pocket. He picked up the car keys from his desk, the gesture filled with an urgency that had nothing to do with cash flow or the price of gold. As he passed the housekeeper, he said only, "I'm going out. I don't know when I'll be back." He didn't look back. He didn't see the expression of shock and disapproval on Mrs. Gable's face. He just knew he had to go. He had to find her. And, for the first time in a long time, he was following an impulse that couldn't be measured, only felt. The drive from the beachfront to the neighborhood was a journey between worlds. Richard's luxury car, one of his many assets that served more as a status symbol than a mode of transport, glided silently through streets that became progressively narrower, more colorful, more alive. The mirrored glass skyscrapers gave way to two-story houses with laundry drying in the windows. The sound of impatient horns was replaced by a mix of a distant reggaeton beat, the laughter of children, and the call of a street vendor. A light rain had begun to fall, washing the asphalt and heightening the smell of wet earth. Beside him, in the passenger seat, Leo looked out the window, his large eyes absorbing the profusion of stimuli, but his body was still, as if waiting for something. Richard didn't know what to say to his son. He was acting on pure instinct, a blind investment with no guaranteed return. He just knew he had to try. The address led him to a small park with an old gazebo and concrete benches. He parked the car at a distance under a large almond tree, and then he saw her. Sophia was in the center of the park, sheltered from the rain by the roof of the gazebo. She wasn't alone. A small group of children, 10, maybe 12, surrounded her with devout attention. There were no expensive toys or electronic gadgets. On the ground was a collection of old pots, aluminum cans, and plastic bottles filled with beans. Sophia, with 2 wooden spoons in her hands, was conducting this small recycled orchestra, creating a contagious and joyful rhythm. She was laughing, a free and carefree laugh that Richard had never heard in the apartment. Here, in her own environment, she wasn't the shy, humiliated nanny. She was a conductor, a source of joy, a whole and radiant woman. The scene hit him with the force of a punch. He, the multi-millionaire who measured success in cash flow and stock appreciation, was witnessing true wealth. And he felt a profound shame for having tried to extinguish that light with his arrogance and fear. He stood there, watching for long minutes, his heart beating erratically. Finally, he turned off the car. As he got out, the light rain dampened his shoulders. He opened the door for Leo, who followed him, holding his hand tightly. As they approached, the sound of the pots and cans faded. The children stopped playing one by one, their curious eyes fixed on the strange man in expensive clothes invading their space. Silence fell. Sophia turned. When she saw him, her smile vanished. The sparkle in her eyes was replaced by a look of caution, a shadow of the pain he himself had caused. She straightened up, her body tense, waiting. He stopped a few feet from her, feeling clumsy, exposed. All the words he had rehearsed on the drive disappeared. There was no more pomp or pride. There was only a broken man asking for help. "Sophia," he said, his voice hoarse, "you taught my son how to listen. And that, without knowing it, you taught me, too." She stared at him, her eyes welling up, but said nothing. Her silence was a wall. But then, Leo, who until that moment had been hiding behind his father's legs, let go of his hand. He took 2 hesitant steps forward, reached out his small hand, and tugged on the hem of Sophia's skirt. And, looking up at her, he smiled. A small smile, but as bright as the sun after the rain. Leo's smile was the bridge that reconnected 2 worlds. Sophia didn't need words or promises. The boy's gesture was the only guarantee her heart required. She returned, but not as before. The hierarchy of boss and employee, once so rigid, had dissolved in the rain of that park. Now, they were 3 people trying to learn a new melody together. The luxury apartment, once a mausoleum of glass and silence, began to breathe. Mornings were no longer started by the sound of stock market notifications, but by the aroma of warm bread. Sophia insisted on baking, and, to everyone's surprise, by the hesitant sound of a guitar. Richard had found the instrument in a storage unit, an heirloom from his teenage years that he had abandoned for the urgency of building his fortune. His fingers, accustomed to keyboards and screens, were clumsy. The notes came out crooked, but Leo didn't mind. The boy would sit at his feet, his head resting on his father's knee, listening to the effort with serene concentration. It was in these moments that Sophia would watch them from a distance, her heart tight with an emotion that was a mixture of joy and fear. The nights became a refuge for conversations that blossomed in the silence after Leo fell asleep. Sitting on the balcony, with the illuminated city at their feet, they shared stories. She spoke of the children in the park, of the beauty she found in simplicity, of how music was the universal language that didn't distinguish between wealth and poverty. He, for the first time, spoke not of his business or his assets, but of his loneliness, the weight of living up to expectations, the fear of failing his son. The attraction between them grew with every word exchanged, every lingering glance, every time their hands accidentally brushed while reaching for a cup of tea. It was an electric current, undeniable and powerful, but with it, fear also deepened. Richard, reading an article about himself in a finance magazine that called him the Midas of the crypto market, felt the weight of his world's judgment. How would he explain to his social circle, to the shareholders of his company, that the woman who was healing his family was his son's nanny? Sophia felt the chasm in another way. One day, a delivery service brought a new piece of art to the apartment, an abstract sculpture that cost more than she would earn in a lifetime. Looking at that cold, expensive object, she felt the crushing weight of their differences. She was falling in love with a man who lived in a different galaxy from hers. What to him was a simple possession, to her was a universe of distance. The fear of being just a temporary diversion, an exotic curiosity in a billionaire's life, haunted her. She feared that once Leo was completely well, she would become dispensable, an investment that had already yielded its profit and could be discarded. The tension was palpable, a taut wire that could snap at any moment. Mrs. Gable, noticing the change in the house's dynamics and feeling her authority diminish, watched everything with growing resentment. One afternoon, while Sophia was cleaning up a glass Leo had spilled, the housekeeper approached, her voice hissing like a snake. "You're smart, aren't you? You know that a man like Mr. Richard is an easy mark. You're making a very clever investment." Sophia froze, the cruel words hitting her full force. At that exact moment, Richard walked into the kitchen, just in time to see Sophia's pale, devastated face and the triumphant smirk on Mrs. Gable's face dissolving. The silence in the kitchen grew dense, heavy. Richard saw Sophia's face, a mask of pain and humiliation, and felt a cold, calculated fury take hold of him. It wasn't the explosive anger of a lost deal, but the sharp clarity of someone seeing a threat to an irreplaceable asset. He looked at Mrs. Gable, who turned pale under his gaze. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His power was in the silence that followed, a silence worth more than any shout. "Elvira," he said, his tone as low and sharp as the tip of a knife, "your employment in this house is terminated. The finance department will deposit your severance tomorrow. Be gone in an hour." There was no room for discussion. It was an executive order, final and irrevocable. The housekeeper opened her mouth to protest, but closed it when she saw the look on his face. She just nodded, defeated, and retreated, leaving behind the vibration of a power Sophia had never witnessed so up close. She felt protected, but also frightened. The ease with which he had dismissed someone who had worked there for years was a terrifying reminder of the world he lived in. a world where people could be liquidated like underperforming stocks. Richard turned to her, the fury in his eyes giving way to genuine concern. "Are you okay?" She just nodded, unable to speak. He led her to the living room, had her sit down, and brought her a glass of water. A gesture so simple and thoughtful it contrasted violently with the ruthlessness he had just shown. As she drank, his mind was working at high speed. The incident with Mrs. Gable was a symptom of a larger problem. His world, with its Brooks and its Mrs. Gables, would always see Sophia as an intruder, a threat to his assets. He needed to protect her, not just with gestures, but with a structure. His mind, trained to find strategic solutions and optimize results, came to a conclusion that, to him, seemed perfect. He would protect her using the tools he mastered: money, status, and a contract. It was the best investment he could make in his family's happiness. Later that night, after Leo was asleep, he called her into his office. The room, once the stage for her humiliation, was now softly lit. He seemed nervous, which surprised her. "Sophia, what happened today can't happen again," he began. "Just I've been thinking about how to ensure your safety and your place here, not just as an employee, but as the fundamental piece you are to Leo's well-being and to mine." Her heart leaped. Was this the conversation she had both feared and longed for? He continued, sliding a document across the desk toward her. "I've created a new position for you. Sensory Development Therapeutic Coordinator. It's a formal title, with a contract that guarantees your rights and a salary. Well, a salary that reflects your invaluable worth to us." She looked at the paper, the pompous title and the number at the end. With so many zeros it looked unreal, sent a chill down her spine. He was talking about returns, about cash flow, about formalizing her affection into an asset. He wasn't getting closer. He was promoting her. That gesture, which in his mind was the ultimate proof of care and protection, was for her the confirmation of her greatest fear. He saw her as the best of investments, but an investment nonetheless. She lifted her eyes from the paper, the glimmer of hope extinguished, replaced by a deep and overwhelming disappointment. He wasn't offering his heart. He was offering a job title. "Richard," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "I am not one of your business deals." Sophia's words hung in the air, so simple and so devastating. Richard stared at her, confusion written all over his face. He didn't understand. In his world, this was the pinnacle of recognition. He was offering security, status, a sum of money that would change her life forever. It was a testament to her value, a way to shield her from the world's prejudice, to elevate her to an unassailable position. It was, in his market-based logic, the greatest declaration he could make. He was moving her from the vulnerable liabilities category and making her an essential asset, contract and all. Why couldn't she see that? "I don't understand," he said, genuinely lost. "I'm trying to protect you. I'm trying to give you what you deserve." But what he didn't realize was that by trying to protect her with the tools of his world, contracts, titles, money, he was imprisoning her in it, defining her worth in terms that were not her own. He was turning her into an inheritance for Leo, a wellness fund, but not a partner for himself. The pain in her eyes was palpable. She felt used, invisible, as if her genuine affection had been appraised and priced, turned into another item in Richard's vast portfolio of assets. "You can't buy what I give freely, Richard," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You can't put a price on caring. The moment you do, it dies." She pushed the contract back toward him. "I can't accept this." Without another word, she turned and left the office, leaving him stunned, the paper with the pompous title and astronomical figure looking ridiculous on the mahogany desk. That night, Sophia didn't sleep. She sat by the window of her small apartment in her neighborhood and looked at the sky, feeling a deep ache. She loved that boy, and, God forgive her, she was falling in love with his father. too, but she couldn't live as a piece on his chessboard. By morning, she had made her decision. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. She packed her things, gathered the small instruments she had made for Leo, and put them in a box. In her notebook, where she recorded the boy's progress, she paused on a blank page. With a trembling hand, she wrote just one sentence. She left the notebook on Leo's small nightstand, along with the box of instruments, as a silent farewell. When Richard woke up, the house was strangely quiet. There was no smell of warm bread, no soft sound of a melody. He felt a tightness in his chest. He went to Leo's room. The boy was awake, sitting on his bed, staring intently at the open notebook. Richard approached. On the notebook's cover was an envelope. Inside, a short, formal letter of resignation. His heart sank. He looked at the notebook, at the page Leo was observing. Sophia's handwriting, delicate and firm, read, "Music doesn't heal, but it teaches the heart how to wait." At that moment, Leo looked up at his father, and for the first time, Richard saw silent tears streaming down his son's face. Richard's world, the empire he had built with such precision and control, collapsed. Without Sophia, the apartment was once again a cold, empty glass box. Without Sophia's joy, Leo retreated back into his shell of silence. And without the presence of them both, Richard finally understood the true meaning of bankruptcy. He was completely, irredeemably broken. The days following Sophia's departure were the very definition of bankruptcy. Richard, the man who had turned a small initial capital into $1 billion fortune, discovered a type of poverty that no financial asset could cover. The apartment, which for a brief period had become a home, regressed to its original state of a luxury vault, cold and impersonal. Silence was the only dividend his investment in pride had paid him. He tried everything. He bought new sound systems, downloaded playlists of calming music, tried to replicate the activities he had seen Sophia do, but it was useless. He was like an investor trying to replicate a successful formula without understanding the soul of the business. The intention was missing. The love, the secret ingredient that wasn't in any manual. Leo, sensing the absence of the one person who spoke his language, raised his walls again, higher and more impenetrable than before. He refused to take off his headphones, and the sound he heard inside seemed to be his only refuge from the sadness that permeated the air. Richard's net worth, visible in every piece of art and every square foot of that penthouse, had never seemed so useless, so mocking. One stormy night, Richard's desperation reached its climax. The rain beat furiously against the glass, and the sound of thunder echoed through the apartment, a violent contrast to the deathly silence within. Leo had had a meltdown, the worst in months, and was now sleeping an exhausted sleep, his small face marked with dried tears. Richard felt like a ghost in his own life, haunted by the echo of his son's laughter. Sitting in the boy's dark room, his gaze fell on the notebook Sophia had left behind. He picked it up with trembling hands. Until then, he had avoided touching it as if it were the final proof of his failure. But that night, with nothing left to lose, he opened it, page after page. He delved into his son's universe through Sophia's eyes. These weren't clinical notes, they were poems. Today, Leo smiled at the sound of the rain. "I think he likes sounds that ask for nothing in return." He arranged the pencils by color and kept tapping with the yellow one. Maybe it's the color of the sun in his music. He flipped through the pages, each entry a small blow to his heart. And then, near the end, he found a paragraph that seemed to have been written with a different kind of ink, the ink of revelation. Her handwriting seemed more rushed, as if recording a sudden, wonderful discovery. He read the words, and the world stopped spinning. "Something incredible happened today. I was playing a lullaby on the floor, and Leo wouldn't let me get close. But then, I heard the sound of the elevator. He heard it too. He recognized the sound of your shoes in the hallway, and it was in that moment, while he was listening for his father to arrive, that he reached out his hand and let me touch his fingers for the first time. He wasn't waiting for me. He wasn't waiting for the music. He was waiting for you. Maybe his love doesn't start with the melody. Maybe it starts with the sound of your voice. Richard read the sentence once, twice, 3 times. The air left his lungs. A shockwave coursed through his body, shattering the icy crust that had encased his heart for years. And then, for the first time since his wife's passing, for the first time in his adult life, Richard wept. A convulsive, silent cry that liquidated years of pride, fear, and self-imposed loneliness. He wept for the lost time, for the arrogance that had blinded him, for the truth that a simple woman had shown him. He wasn't the obstacle, he was the origin. The key to his son's music had always been inside him. The morning sun found a different Richard. The previous night's tears had washed away not only his pain, but also his armor. He looked at his own reflection in the balcony glass and didn't see the billionaire, the titan of business, but just a father who had rediscovered his way home. The revelation in Sophia's notebook wasn't just information, it was a compass. He knew what he had to do, not with the calculated urgency of an investor closing a deal, but with the serene certainty of someone who finally understands the true value of his greatest treasure. He didn't call his office, didn't check the price of Bitcoin. He just made breakfast for Leo, sat beside him, and without a word began to hum a tuneless melody, a lullaby his own mother used to sing to him. Leo didn't react, but he didn't pull away either. It was a start. Later, he took his son's hand and said, "Let's go for a walk." And, for the first time, Leo didn't resist. They went to the only place that mattered, to the park in her neighborhood. She was there, as he knew she would be, surrounded by her little orchestra of children, conducting the symphony of cans and pots with the same infectious joy. Richard's heart pounded. This time, there was no rain, only the golden afternoon sunlight filtering through the trees. He watched from a distance for a moment, taking in the scene, the simple and powerful beauty of this woman. He was no longer the wealthy, arrogant man who had watched her the first time. He was a pilgrim. Leo, beside him, let go of his hand and pointed to the gazebo, a glimmer of recognition in his eyes. Richard took a deep breath and walked toward her. The children stopped playing, silence falling once more, but this time it was not a silence of strangeness, but of expectation. Sophia turned, and their eyes met. The surprise on her face was quickly replaced by an emotion he couldn't decipher. She waited. He stopped before her. This time, he didn't try to apologize with words that would sound empty. He didn't offer contracts, or money, or promises. He did the only thing that mattered. He held out his hand to her, palm open, in a silent invitation. An invitation to dance, right there in the middle of the park, as she had done with his son. Sophia's eyes filled with tears. She looked at his outstretched hand, then at his face, and she saw the vulnerability, the sincerity, the truth that was no longer hidden behind figures and pride, and she accepted. She placed her hand in his, and the circle was complete. He pulled her close, awkwardly, and they began to sway, a slow step to one side, then the other, with no music. But then one of the children, the smallest one, picked up 2 spoons and began to tap on a can, a simple, hesitant rhythm. Another followed, and then another. In moments, the makeshift orchestra started to play again, a soft and rhythmic melody created just for them. It was there, under the sound of pots and the laughter of children, that their love was finally declared, without a single word. It was a dance of forgiveness, of reunion, of 2 souls finally finding the same frequency. And on the edge of the gazebo, Leo watched, a radiant smile on his face, clapping his hands to the rhythm of the music. He didn't need the headphones anymore. The world's music finally made sense. 2 weeks later, the penthouse apartment was unrecognizable, not because of the furniture or the breathtaking view, which remained the same, but because of the life that pulsed in every corner. The silence, once a permanent resident, had been evicted to make way for a soft melody coming from a small speaker in the living room. The air, once cold and sterile, now carried the sweet scent of carrot cake baking in the oven. Colorful balloons, tied with ribbons that danced in the breeze from the balcony, painted the room with a joy that no expensive work of art ever could. It was Leo's 6th birthday, and Sophia was orchestrating a party that was the opposite of everything the place had ever represented. It was simple, it was small, it was immensely happy. Richard watched her from a distance as she placed the candles on the cake, and he felt a peace that none of his great achievements in the business world had ever given him. He finally understood the fundamental difference between wealth and fortune. Wealth was what he accumulated in his investment funds. Fortune was this: the sound of Sophia's laughter mixing with the anticipation in his son's eyes. He approached her just as she lit the last candle. He was holding a gift, wrapped in blue paper. "I think it's time," he said, his voice soft. Sophia smiled, and the three of them gathered around the small table. They sang a tuneless and joyful happy birthday, and Leo, with his father's help, blew out the candles with surprising force, his eyes shining with the light of the flames. After the cake, Richard handed him the present. Leo unwrapped it carefully. It was his colorful headphones, the same as always, but refurbished, polished, looking brand new. The boy looked at them with some hesitation, as if seeing an old ghost. But Richard knelt in front of him. "I did something to them," he explained. "Press play." Leo put on the headphones and, with his little finger, pressed the button. His eyes widened. It wasn't white noise or some random music. It was the sound of his father's guitar, a simple melody he had been practicing, and over it, Richard's voice, not speaking, but singing a lullaby, the same one he hummed in the mornings. Richard stood up, extending one hand to Sophia and the other to Leo. "Dance with me?" And there, in the middle of the living room, the three of them began to dance, a slow, gentle dance. Leo, between them, smiled, his face turned upward, his eyes closed, finally at peace with the sound. Later, as night fell and the city lights twinkled like a diamond necklace on the dark velvet of the sea, they were on the balcony. Leo, nestled between them, was still wearing the headphones. The air was cool, and the only sound was the distant murmur of the waves. Then, the boy did something that would seal the transformation forever. He took off the headphones. He looked at his father, and with a deliberate gesture, placed one ear cup on his ear. Then he turned to Sophia and extended the other to her. For a moment, the three of them stood there, connected by that arc of colored plastic, listening to the same simple melody, the same love-filled voice. The sound of the world outside, the horns, the sirens, the waves, was no longer a threat, it was just the accompaniment. Leo then turned to his father, his eyes clear and present. His voice, when it came, was soft and clear, breaking the silence of the night. "Now," he said, with a wisdom far beyond his 6 years, "now the noise is beautiful." The phrase hung in the air, an absolute truth, because the noise, at last, was no longer about isolation. It was the noise of life, and for them, it was the noise of love.